Sometimes grief teaches us to ignore the signs that matter most. Sometimes we build our lives around the very things we should fear. Silas Boone had been alone in the Montana mountains for 10 years. Just him and his dog, Jasper. After his wife passed, he found peace in the quiet wilderness. But right outside his cabin, something strange started happening. A small bump in the ground began to grow. Year after year, it got bigger. Silas figured it was just an old tree root or rock pushing up from below. He left it alone, partly out of fear, partly out of superstition. But when that mound reached the size of a grave, and his dog started howling the same way he did at his wife's funeral, Silas knew he had to dig. What had been growing beneath his home for 10 long years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like memories that refused to fade, and Silas Boone stood at his cabin window, watching the sun struggle through the Montana peaks. His weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the one with faded blue flowers that Martha had painted during their first winter together. 23 years they'd shared this view, and now 10 years alone had taught him that some silences echo louder than any company ever could. Jasper lay sprawled across the worn wooden floor, his graying muzzle resting on massive paws. The old German shepherd's ears twitched at every forest sound, though his hunting days were long behind him. Silas had found him as a pup, half-starved and shivering in a snowbank the spring after Martha passed. Funny how grief has a way of drawing lost souls together. "Morning, old friend," Silas murmured, scratching behind Jasper's ears. The dog's tail thumped twice against the floorboards, their daily ritual, as dependable as sunrise. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd built his life with deliberate care. Every log had been selected, seasoned, and fitted by Silas's own hands back in 1960, when he and Martha first claimed this patch of wilderness. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by decades of winter fires. Hand-carved shelves held Martha's collection of river stones, each one polished smooth by countless seasons of mountain runoff. A faded quilt, her last project, still draped the back of his reading chair, but it was the mound outside that had changed everything. Silas stepped onto the covered porch, his boots creaking against planks he'd replaced just last summer. The morning air carried the sharp bite of early spring, pine sap, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. He'd grown accustomed to reading the wilderness like other men read newspapers. Every scent, every bird call, every shift in the wind told him what he needed to know about weather, seasons, and the creatures that shared his mountain, except for that mound. It sat 20 feet from his front steps, perfectly round and rising about 4 feet from the forest floor. What had started as a barely noticeable rise in the earth had grown steadily, season after season. Silas remembered the first time he'd noticed it, just a gentle swell in the ground, like the earth was taking a deep breath. He'd stepped on it that day, testing its firmness. The soil had felt soft but solid, warm even in the cool mountain air. That should have been his first warning. Now, a decade later, the mound commanded attention. Grass grew thick and unusually green around its base, and wildflowers bloomed there even in late fall when frost had claimed everything else. No matter the season, no matter the weather, that patch of earth remained vibrant with life. "Too vibrant. You see it too, don't you, boy?" Silas said, noticing how Jasper had joined him on the porch but kept his distance from the stairs. The dog's hackles weren't raised, but his posture held that peculiar tension that comes from sensing something beyond ordinary understanding. Silas descended the steps slowly, his 68-year-old knees reminding him of every harsh winter he'd endured. The closer he got to the mound, the more wrong it felt. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in the way that dreams sometimes felt wrong, even when nothing bad was happening in them. The earth around it seemed to pulse with a rhythm just slightly off from his own heartbeat. He'd avoided thinking too deeply about it for years, telling himself it was natural. Ground settled strangely sometimes. Tree roots grew in mysterious ways. Rock formations shifted with freeze and thaw. But deep down, in the part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of mountain living. He knew this wasn't natural. The mound had intent. Silas walked slowly around its perimeter, noting details he'd tried to ignore for too long. The earth was darker here, richer than the surrounding soil. When he knelt and pressed his palm against it, warmth radiated up through his hand. Not the surface warmth of sun-heated ground, but something deeper, something that came from below. A memory surfaced unbidden. Martha's final days, when she'd grown so thin and pale that he could see her pulse through the translucent skin of her temples. She'd spent hours staring out this same window, her eyes fixed on the spot where the mound now grew. "Something's coming, Silas," she'd whispered one evening, her voice barely audible above the wind. Something's been waiting. He'd dismissed it as fever dreams, the morphine talking, anything but the truth his heart had recognized even then. Martha had always been sensitive to things others couldn't see. She'd known when storms were coming days before the weather turned. She'd found water sources by walking the land with nothing but intuition. And she'd known about the mound before it existed. "Foolish old man," Silas muttered, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. But the warmth lingered on his palms, and when he looked back at the cabin, Jasper was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets. The rest of that morning passed in routine. Silas checked his rabbit snares, finding 2 fat cottontails that would make good stew. He split firewood until his back ached, stacking the logs with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. He tended his small garden, noting which vegetables were thriving and which needed attention. Normal tasks for a normal day, except his eyes kept drifting to the mound. By afternoon, clouds had gathered above the peaks, promising rain. Silas settled into his reading chair with a cup of coffee and one of the Western novels he ordered by mail from the town library. But the words blurred together as his mind wandered to other things, to Martha's paintings still hanging on the walls, to the letters from his estranged brother that he'd never answered, to the growing certainty that his solitary life was about to change. The rain started just after sunset, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming against the roof. Silas lit the oil lamps and started a fire, preparing for what looked like a long night. Jasper settled beside his chair, but the dog's restlessness was obvious. He kept lifting his head, ears pricked forward, listening to something Silas couldn't hear. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. But Jasper pulled away and padded to the window, pressing his nose against the glass. Outside, rain darkened the forest and turned the dirt paths to mud. But around the mound, the rain seemed different, lighter, almost luminous in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin windows. And as Silas watched, he could swear the mound was moving. Not dramatically, just a subtle rise and fall, like breathing. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was tricks of light and shadow, but when he looked again, the movement was still there, rhythmic, patient, alive. That night, Silas dreamed of Martha for the first time in months. She stood beside their bed, looking exactly as she had on their wedding day. Young, radiant, filled with hope for the future they'd build together. But her eyes held knowledge that hadn't been there then, a sadness mixed with something that might have been warning. "It's time," she said in the dream, her voice carrying the sound of wind through pine branches. "It's been waiting long enough." "What's been waiting?" Silas asked, but she was already fading, becoming translucent in the lamplight. "What we planted," she whispered, "what we chose together." He woke to Jasper's low whining and pale dawnlight filtering through the windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the world clean and fresh. But when Silas looked outside, his breath caught in his throat. The mound had grown overnight, not by inches, but by at least a foot. And around its base, forming a perfect circle, stood 7 wooden crosses, small, weathered things that looked like they'd been there for decades. Silas had never seen those crosses before in his life. Silas stood frozen at his window, coffee mug trembling in his grip. 7 wooden crosses, each no bigger than his forearm, formed a perfect circle around the mound. The wood was grey with age, carved with symbols he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They hadn't been there when he'd gone to bed. He was certain of that. Jasper whined again, pressing his body against Silas's legs. The dog's warmth was comforting, but it couldn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in Silas's bones. He set down his mug and reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, an old Winchester that had belonged to his father. The weight of it felt familiar in his hands, even though he hadn't fired it in years. "Stay close, boy," he murmured. Stepping onto the porch, the morning air was crisp and clean after the rain, but it carried something else now, a scent like turned earth and old flowers. Like a graveyard after spring rain, Silas descended the steps slowly, his eyes fixed on those impossible crosses. With each step, details became clearer and more disturbing. The symbols carved into the wood weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, purposeful. Some looked like letters from an alphabet he'd never seen, while others resembled the pictographs he'd found in caves during his younger days exploring these mountains. But these symbols seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new patterns that made his head ache. The first cross stood exactly where he'd been standing yesterday when he'd felt the mound's warmth. The carved wood was smooth as riverstone, polished by countless touches. When Silas reached out tentatively, his fingers barely brushing the surface, images flashed through his mind like lightning. Martha, 8 months pregnant, her hand pressed to her swollen belly, her face pale with pain that had nothing to do with labor. "Something's wrong, Silas," she whispered. "Something's very wrong." The vision lasted only a moment, but it left Silas gasping. He jerked his hand back from the cross and stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jasper barked once, sharp and urgent, pulling Silas back to the present. "What the hell?" Silas breathed, staring at the cross. The memory wasn't his, couldn't be his. Martha had never been pregnant. They'd tried for years, but children had never come. It was one of their quiet sorrows, never spoken about but always present. Yet the memory felt as real as his own childhood, as vivid as yesterday's rain. The second cross drew his attention next. This one was darker than the others, its symbols deeper and more elaborate. Against his better judgment, Silas approached it. The wood felt warm under his fingertips, and again the world shifted. This time he saw himself, but younger, carrying something wrapped in an old blanket. His face was streaked with tears, and Martha walked beside him, her own grief evident in every step. They stopped at this exact spot, where the mound now grew, and together they knelt in the dirt. They were burying something small. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Silas dizzy and confused. He had no memory of this scene, yet watching it had felt like reliving a moment from his own life. The emotions were his, the crushing weight of loss, the desperate hope that the earth might somehow heal what they'd lost. "This isn't possible," he said aloud, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Jasper had moved to the third cross and was sniffing around its base. His tail was tucked low, and he kept looking back at Silas with an expression that seemed almost human in its concern. When Silas approached, the dog backed away, whining softly. This cross was different from the others. The wood was lighter, almost white, and the symbols carved into it seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. The moment Silas's fingers made contact, the world exploded into sensation. He was standing in this same spot, but the landscape was different. The cabin was gone, replaced by older structures, a small log house and what looked like a root cellar. The forest was thicker, more primitive, and Martha was there, but not the Martha he'd known. This woman had Martha's face, but dressed in clothes from another time, a long skirt and apron that belonged to the 1800s. "The children need to be protected," she was saying, to a man who looked like Silas, but couldn't be. "Silas, the sickness is spreading. We have to put them somewhere safe." "But they're already gone," the man replied, his voice thick with grief. "We lost them all." "No," the woman insisted. "Not gone, sleeping, waiting for the right time to wake up." Together they began to dig, 7 small graves in a perfect circle. And as they worked, they placed wooden crosses at the head of each grave, crosses that looked exactly like the ones now surrounding the mound. The vision faded, leaving Silas on his knees in the wet grass, shaking uncontrollably. Jasper was beside him, licking his face with warm, worried strokes. The dog's presence anchored him to reality, but that reality had just shifted on its axis. The crosses weren't new. They'd been here before, decades ago, maybe more than a century ago, and somehow, impossibly, he and Martha had been here too. Not as themselves, but as different people living different lives in different times. Yet the grief had been the same. The loss had been the same. The desperate love that drives people to impossible choices had been the same. Silas struggled to his feet, using the rifle as support. His legs felt unsteady, and his mind reeled with implications he wasn't ready to accept. But there were 4 more crosses, and despite every instinct screaming at him to run, he knew he had to touch them all, had to see what they remembered. The 4th cross showed him a family from the early 1900s, a man and woman who wore his face and Martha's, tending to children who grew sick and died one by one. The 5th revealed settlers from the 1870s, again with familiar faces, again losing children to some unnamed plague. The 6th took him back even further to what looked like the Civil War era, where the same grief played out with the same devastating results. But it was the 7th cross that broke him completely. This vision was older than the rest, older than the European settlement of these mountains. He saw Native Americans, a man and woman whose spirits he recognized, even though their faces were different, standing around 7 small graves. The woman was chanting in a language he'd never heard but somehow understood. "Let them sleep until the circle is complete," she sang. "Let them wait until love calls them home." When the vision ended, Silas found himself sprawled in the dirt beside the mound, tears streaming down his face. The sun had moved across the sky. Hours had passed while he'd been lost in those impossible memories. Jasper lay beside him, keeping watch, his brown eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed ancient. The truth settled into Silas's bones like winter cold. This place was more than his home. It was a place where the same souls had returned again and again, drawn by forces beyond understanding. He and Martha weren't the first to lose children here, and they wouldn't be the last. But somehow, in some way, he couldn't yet grasp. All those lost children were sleeping beneath the mound, waiting for something, waiting for him to set them free, as if responding to his thoughts. The mound pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat. And from somewhere deep below, Silas could swear he heard the faint sound of children laughing. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disbelief and desperate rationalization. Silas found himself pacing the cabin like a caged animal, trying to convince himself that what he'd experienced was nothing more than vivid hallucinations brought on by isolation and old age. But every time he looked out the window, those 7 crosses stood in their perfect circle, and the sound of children's laughter seemed to drift up from the earth itself. Jasper followed his movements with worried eyes, occasionally whining when Silas's pacing became too frantic. The dog had always been perceptive, but today his behavior bordered on the supernatural. He refused to eat, wouldn't venture near the door, and kept positioning himself between Silas and the window as if trying to shield him from something. "You see it too, don't you?" Silas murmured, kneeling beside his faithful companion. "You know there's something out there that shouldn't be." As evening approached, Silas forced himself to focus on mundane tasks. He prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, though the food tasted like ash in his mouth. He split kindling for the fire, checked his water supply, and oiled the Winchester's action, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But no amount of routine could chase away the memories that weren't his own. The most disturbing part wasn't the visions themselves, but how natural they'd felt. Each life he'd glimpsed seemed as real and valid as his current existence. The grief of losing children over and over again had layered itself in his heart like sedimentary rock, each loss building upon the last until the weight of it threatened to crush him. As darkness fell, Silas lit the oil lamps and settled into his reading chair, but the book remained closed in his lap. Instead, he found himself studying Martha's paintings on the walls, landscapes of their mountain home, rendered in soft watercolors. He'd looked at these paintings thousands of times over the years, but tonight he noticed details that made his blood run cold. In the painting above the fireplace, Martha had captured their valley in early spring. The trees were just beginning to bud, and snow still clung to the higher peaks. But there, in the foreground where their cabin now stood, she'd painted 7 small mounds, arranged in a circle. Not one large mound like the current anomaly, but 7 distinct graves. And standing among them, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were the ghostly figures of children. Silas rose from his chair and approached the painting, his heart hammering. How had he never noticed this before? The children were painted so faintly they were almost transparent, but once seen they couldn't be unseen. 7 small figures, each standing beside one of the mounds, their faces turned toward the viewer with expressions of infinite patience. "Martha, what did you know?" he whispered to the empty room. He moved to the next painting, a winter scene that showed their cabin covered in snow. Again, the 7 mounds were there, though covered by white drifts. And again, the children were visible, this time huddled together as if sharing warmth, their breath visible in the cold air, despite being mere suggestions of paint on canvas. Every painting told the same story. Martha had seen them, had known about them, had been documenting their presence for years without ever speaking a word about it to Silas. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His wife had been keeping secrets. Secrets about their land, about their purpose here, about the children who waited beneath the earth. A new artifact caught his attention, something he'd somehow overlooked despite living with it for years. On the mantelpiece, partially hidden behind a stack of books, sat a small wooden box that Martha had carved during one of her long recoveries from illness. The box was decorated with the same symbols he'd seen on the crosses, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Silas's hands trembled as he lifted the box. It was heavier than it should have been, and warm to the touch. The lid opened with a soft sigh, releasing a scent of lavender and something else, something that reminded him of newborn babies and morning milk. Inside, nestled in faded blue fabric, lay 7 small objects. At first glance, they looked like ordinary river stones, smooth and rounded by countless years of water and weather. But as Silas lifted the first one, he realized these weren't stones at all. They were carved from some material he couldn't identify, harder than wood, softer than stone, and shot through with veins of color that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Each carved piece was different, but all shared a common theme. They were toys. A small horse, a wooden doll, a tiny flute, a miniature wagon, a carved bird, a little boat, and a spinning top. Children's toys, crafted with the kind of love and attention that only comes from a parent's hand. The moment Silas touched the horse, another vision overwhelmed him. But this one was different from the others, softer, warmer, filled with joy instead of grief. He saw Martha, pregnant and glowing with health, her hands busy carving the little horse. She was humming a lullaby, her face serene with maternal happiness. "For our son," she said to someone outside the vision's scope. "He'll love horses, won't you, little one?" Her hand moved to her belly, and Silas could swear he saw the outline of a tiny foot pushing against her dress. The vision shifted, showing Martha carving each toy in turn, each one crafted for a specific child. 7 children who existed in possibility, in hope, in the space between dreaming and waking. Children who had never been born in this life, but who had been born and lost in others. As the final vision faded, Silas understood. The toys weren't just Martha's handiwork, they were anchors, physical objects that connected the sleeping children to the world above, keeping their spirits tethered to this place across multiple lifetimes. Martha had been preparing for them, calling to them, ensuring they would have something familiar when they finally woke up. "Sweet Lord," Silas breathed, sinking back into his chair with the box clutched against his chest. What have we gotten ourselves into? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof. But beneath the natural sounds of the mountain night, Silas could hear something else, a soft, scratching sound like small fingers tapping against wood, like children knocking at the door, asking to come inside where it was warm and safe. Jasper lifted his head and looked toward the front door, his ears pricked forward. For a moment, his tail wagged tentatively as if he recognized the sound. Then he whined and pressed closer to Silas's legs, seeking comfort from the one person in this strange situation who might understand what was happening. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. 7 distinct rhythms, like 7 small hands all knocking at once. And with each knock, the carved toys in the box grew warmer, their inner light growing brighter until they illuminated Silas's face with a soft, ethereal glow. Whatever was coming, it was coming tonight. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so profound that Silas could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears. He sat frozen in his chair, the wooden box of toys still clutched against his chest, afraid to move or breathe too loudly. Jasper had gone rigid beside him, every muscle tense with anticipation. Then, cutting through the quiet like a knife, came the sound of children singing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, wordless but achingly familiar. The same lullaby Martha used to hum while she worked in her garden. 7 young voices wove together in perfect harmony, their song drifting through the walls as if the cabin itself had become transparent. The sound was both joyful and heartbreaking, filled with the innocence of youth and the wisdom of souls who had waited far too long. Silas forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. The logical part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that dead children don't sing lullabies in the Montana wilderness. But his heart knew better. His heart recognized something in those voices, a longing that matched his own, a love that transcended death and time. Moving carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath him, Silas approached the front window. The oil lamp cast a warm circle of light around his chair, but beyond the glass lay darkness so complete it seemed solid. He pressed his face to the cold pane, straining to see into the night. At first, there was nothing. Then gradually, shapes began to emerge from the blackness around the mound. 7 small figures, translucent as morning mist, stood in a circle around the earthen rise. They appeared to be children ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 12, dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore the simple homespun of frontier families, others the more formal attire of later decades. But all of them shared the same expression of patient hope. As Silas watched, transfixed, one of the children, a little girl in a faded blue dress, turned toward the cabin. Her face was Martha's face in miniature, with the same gentle eyes and stubborn chin. When she smiled, Silas felt his heart break and mend simultaneously. This was the daughter he and Martha had never had, the child who existed in dreams and might-have-beens. The girl raised her hand and pressed it against the invisible barrier that separated the spirit world from the physical one. Her lips moved, forming words Silas couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Papa, we've been waiting for you." Behind her, the other children began to move closer to the cabin. A boy who looked like a younger version of Silas himself, his hair tousled and his overalls dirt-stained from play. Twin girls who held hands and moved in perfect synchronization, their matching dresses pristine despite the decades they'd spent sleeping in the earth. An older boy with serious eyes and careful movements, as if he felt responsible for the younger ones. A toddler who couldn't have been more than 3, stumbling on chubby legs but never falling. And finally, a child whose features seemed to shift and blur, as if he or she hadn't yet decided what form to take. As they drew nearer to the cabin, details became clearer and more heartbreaking. These weren't the pale, frightening specters of ghost stories. They were vibrant with life, their faces animated with curiosity and excitement. They looked like children who had been napping too long and were finally ready to wake up and play. The singing grew louder, more insistent. And with each note, the toys in the wooden box grew warmer. Silas looked down to see them glowing like embers, pulsing in rhythm with the ethereal melody. The carved horse seemed to prance in his palm, while the little boat rocked as if floating on invisible waves. "They want to come home," Silas whispered, the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. They want to come home, and Martha's been calling them back. But even as his heart opened to these impossible children, his mind rebelled against the implications. How could he care for 7 children who existed between life and death? How could he give them the love and guidance they deserved when he was just one aging man, with more questions than answers? As if sensing his doubts, the children began to fade. Their singing grew softer, more distant, and their forms became increasingly transparent. The little girl who had first spoken to him looked directly into his eyes, her expression now tinged with sadness. She mouthed another message, "Don't let us sleep forever, Papa." Then they were gone, vanishing into the darkness as if they'd never been there at all. The mountain silence returned, broken only by the wind through the pine trees and Jasper's anxious panting. Silas remained at the window long after the apparitions had disappeared, staring at the mound that now looked ordinary and innocent in the starlight. But the wooden box in his hands still radiated warmth, and the scent of lavender and baby powder lingered in the air. The evidence of what he'd witnessed couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. Moving like a sleepwalker, Silas returned to his chair and carefully placed the box on the side table. His mind raced with implications and possibilities, but underneath the confusion lay a growing certainty. Those children weren't just random spirits trapped in his land. They were his children, his and Martha's, across multiple lifetimes. The family they'd always dreamed of having was waiting for him to find the courage to accept them. But acceptance came with a price. Silas could feel it in his bones, in the way the air seemed thicker now, charged with supernatural energy. Opening his heart to these children would change everything. It would mean abandoning his simple, solitary life and embracing a reality that most people would consider insane. As he pondered this impossible choice, Silas became aware of a new presence in the room. He looked up to find Martha standing beside the fireplace, as solid and real as she'd ever been in life. She wore the same dress she'd been buried in, a simple blue garment with tiny white flowers, but her face glowed with health and happiness. "Hello, my love," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of summer mornings and the comfort of shared decades. "I've been waiting for you to see them. They've been so patient, but they need their papa now." Silas tried to speak, but no words came. Martha smiled and moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek with fingers that felt as real as his own skin. "It's time to bring our children home," she whispered. "It's time to complete the circle." Martha's touch was warm and familiar, but her presence filled Silas with equal measures of joy and terror. 10 years of grief collapsed into a single moment of recognition, followed by the crushing realization that if Martha was here, standing before him, as real as breathing, then everything he thought he knew about life and death had just shattered. "Martha," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "How?" she murmured, pressing a finger to his lips. "There isn't much time. The children are growing restless, and the barrier between worlds grows thin. They need you to make a choice, Silas. They need you to choose love over fear." She moved with the same grace he remembered, settling into the chair across from him, as if the last 10 years had been nothing more than a long afternoon. But her eyes held depths of knowledge that hadn't been there in life, secrets of places beyond the veil of mortality. "I don't understand any of this," Silas admitted, his hands trembling as he reached toward her. "The visions, the crosses, the children, none of it makes sense." Martha's smile was infinitely patient. "Not everything that matters makes sense, my love. Some truths are too large for our minds to hold all at once. But your heart knows, doesn't it? Your heart recognizes them." She gestured toward the window, where the mound sat silent under the stars. "We've been bound to this place for longer than history remembers. Different names, different faces, but always the same souls finding each other across the years." and always losing what we loved most. The children in the visions, Silas said slowly, pieces of the puzzle clicking together. They were ours. All of them, across all those lifetimes. Yes, Martha confirmed. 7 souls who chose to wait rather than move on to whatever comes next. They've been sleeping beneath that earth, growing stronger with each passing year, sustained by love and the promise of reunion. Silas looked down at the wooden box, where the carved toys continued to glow with soft inner light. That's why you made these. To call them back, to anchor them, Martha corrected. To give them something to hold on to while they waited for their papa to find the courage to dig them up. The weight of responsibility settled on Silas's shoulders like a mountain. 7 children, waiting for him to choose their fate. 7 souls who had trusted him across multiple lifetimes to eventually make the right decision. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. What if I'm not strong enough? He asked. What if I can't give them what they need? Martha reached across the space between them and took his weathered hands in hers. You've already given them everything they need, Silas. You've given them love. The rest is just details. She stood and moved to the mantelpiece, where she picked up a photograph that Silas had forgotten existed. It showed their wedding day. 2 young people full of dreams and plans standing before a simple altar in the town church. But as Martha held the frame, the image began to change. The photograph shifted and blurred, becoming a window into other times, other ceremonies. Silas saw himself and Martha in frontier clothing, pledging their love before a circuit preacher. He saw them in Native American dress, joining hands in a ceremony beside a sacred fire. Each image showed the same souls, finding each other across the centuries, making the same promises, dreaming the same dreams. We keep choosing each other, Martha said softly. Life after life, year after year, and now our children are ready to join us in this world, instead of waiting for the next one. But even as his heart opened to the possibility, practical concerns crowded Silas's mind. How can I raise 7 children at my age? I'm 68 years old, Martha. I can barely take care of myself and Jasper. Martha's laughter was like music, filling the cabin with warmth. Oh, my practical husband, still trying to solve supernatural problems with ordinary solutions. She set the photograph back on the mantel, where it continued to cycle through their various incarnations. These aren't ordinary children, Silas. They don't need ordinary care. They need acknowledgement. They need acceptance. They need a father who will love them enough to let them exist. As if summoned by her words, the children appeared again outside the window. But this time they were clearer, more solid, their forms taking on weight and substance. The little girl in the blue dress pressed both palms against the glass, her breath fogging the pain from the outside, something that should have been impossible for a spirit. They're becoming more real, Silas observed, wonder creeping into his voice. Because you're believing in them, Martha explained. Faith has power here. Love has power. The more you accept them, the more solid they become. One by one, the other children approached the cabin. The serious older boy, he looked about 12, began examining the wooden structure with the careful attention of someone checking for weaknesses. The twins moved in perfect synchronization, their identical faces pressed to different windows as they peered inside with curiosity. The toddler stumbled and fell in the grass, but instead of crying, he giggled and rolled onto his back to stare at the stars. What are their names? Silas asked, his throat tight with emotion. The same names you've given them in your heart, Martha replied. Listen to what you call them when you're not thinking about it. Silas focused on the children, and somehow, impossibly, their names rose in his mind like bubbles in still water. The little girl was Emily, sweet, determined Emily, who would grow up to paint landscapes like her mother. The serious boy was Samuel, born with an old soul and a natural talent for leadership. The twins were Rose and Lily, inseparable as morning and evening stars. The toddler was James, perpetually joyful and utterly fearless. The quiet one who seemed to shift between genders was River, a soul too complex for simple categories. And the boy who looked like young Silas was Thomas, stubborn and brave and loyal to his bones. I know them, Silas breathed. I remember them all. Of course you do, Martha said. They're part of you. They've always been part of you, waiting for the right time to come home. A new artifact materialized on the table beside Silas's chair, an old leather journal he'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the pages within were filled with Martha's careful handwriting. As he opened it, Silas realized it was a record of their various lives together, detailed accounts of each incarnation and the children they'd lost in each timeline. I've been keeping track, Martha explained, trying to understand the pattern, looking for the key that would finally break the cycle. And I found it, Silas. The answer was always so simple. She pointed to the final entry in the journal, written in fresh ink that couldn't have been more than hours old. The children will wake when love overcomes fear, when their father chooses to dig with his own hands and call them by name. Outside, 7 young voices began to sing again, their melody rising through the mountain air like incense. And this time Silas heard words in their song, his name, Martha's name, and a plea that went straight to his soul. Come dig us up, Papa. Come set us free. The journal felt heavier than it should have in Silas's hands. Each page weighted with the accumulated grief and love of multiple lifetimes. As he read Martha's careful documentation, a pattern emerged that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. In every incarnation, they had found each other. In every life, they had loved deeply. And in every timeline, they had lost their children to forces beyond their control, disease, accident, war, or simple cruelty of fate. But this time was different. This time, the children hadn't truly died. They had been preserved somehow, kept in a state between life and death, waiting for the moment when their parents would be strong enough to call them home. How long have you known? Silas asked, looking up from the journal to meet Martha's knowing eyes. I've always suspected, she admitted, settling back into her chair. Even as a child, I had dreams about this place. Dreams about children who needed someone to find them. When we first came here and decided to build the cabin, I knew we were meant to be here. I just didn't understand why until it was too late. She gestured toward the window, where the children continued their patient vigil. After I died, the veil lifted. I could see everything, our past lives, their sacrifice, the mechanism that kept them tethered to this world. I've been trying to guide you toward this moment ever since. The paintings, Silas realized. You've been showing me clues all along. And the dreams, Martha added. And the way Jasper always avoided that spot, even though he could sense they were there. Animals are more sensitive to these things than we are. As if hearing his name, Jasper lifted his head from where he'd been lying by the fire. The old dog's eyes moved between Silas and the window, and for the first time in days, his tail wagged tentatively. He could see Martha too, Silas realized. The dog had been watching both of them throughout this entire conversation. Outside, the children's singing had taken on a different quality, less mournful, more hopeful. They seemed to sense that something had shifted inside the cabin, that their long wait might finally be coming to an end. Emily pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath creating patterns of frost that spelled out words. Soon, Papa, soon. But doubt still gnawed at Silas's heart. The rational part of his mind, trained by decades of mountain survival, rebelled against accepting something so far outside the realm of natural law. What if I dig and there's nothing there? What if this is all just the hallucination of a lonely old man losing his grip on reality? Martha's expression grew infinitely tender. Then you'll have spent one night digging in your own yard, and the only thing you'll have lost is a little sleep and some dirt under your fingernails. But if I'm right, if they're really there, waiting for you, then you'll have gained a family that most people only dream of. She reached into her dress and pulled out another artifact, a small silver locket that Silas remembered giving her on their 5th wedding anniversary. Inside had been a picture of the two of them, young and hopeful. But when Martha opened it now, the photograph had changed. Instead of their faces, it showed 7 children gathered around a Christmas tree, their faces glowing with joy and excitement. "This is what we could have," Martha said softly. "This is what they're offering us, not just for this lifetime, but for all the lifetimes to come. They've learned how to transcend death, Silas. They can teach us the same secret." The implications of her words hit him like a physical blow. "You mean we could all be together? Really together? Forever? If you choose it," Martha confirmed. "If you're willing to dig them up and accept what they've become. But it has to be your choice, made freely and with full understanding of what it means." "What does it mean?" Silas asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. Martha stood and moved to the window, her translucent form casting no reflection in the glass. "It means leaving behind the world of ordinary people and ordinary concerns. It means accepting that love is stronger than death, that some bonds can't be broken by anything as simple as mortality. It means becoming something more than human, but also something that most humans would fear and misunderstand." She turned back to face him, her expression serious. "We wouldn't age the way normal people do. We wouldn't die the way normal people do. We'd be connected to this place, to this land, for as long as the mountains stand. And we'd be responsible for protecting other lost souls who find their way here." The weight of the decision pressed down on Silas like a landslide. Accept and gain everything he'd ever wanted at the cost of his humanity. Refuse and condemn 7 innocent souls to sleep forever, while he lived out his remaining years in ordinary loneliness. "What about Jasper?" he asked, looking down at his faithful companion. Martha smiled. "Animals understand love better than people do. He made his choice the day he found us. Look at him, Silas, really look." Silas focused on his dog and gasped. In the lamplight he could see that Jasper wasn't quite as solid as he appeared. There was a translucent quality to his fur, a glow around his edges that suggested he existed in the same space between worlds as Martha and the children. "He died 3 years ago," Martha explained gently. "Heart failure during that bad snowstorm. But he chose to stay, chose to keep you company until you were ready for this moment. He's been protecting you from the loneliness that might have driven you to make this choice for the wrong reasons." The revelation shattered Silas's remaining assumptions about reality. If Jasper had been dead for 3 years, if even his closest companion existed in this supernatural realm, then perhaps the boundary between life and death was far more fluid than he'd ever imagined. "I've been living in a ghost story," he murmured. "You've been living in a love story," Martha corrected. "The rest is just details." Outside, the children had begun to dance around the mound, their movements creating patterns of light in the darkness. The crosses glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with their steps. And from deep beneath the earth came a sound like 7 hearts beating in perfect synchronization, waiting for their father to make the choice that would wake them from their century-long sleep. The shovel hung on a peg beside the door, waiting. The children sang his name with increasing urgency, and Martha watched him with eyes full of patience and hope, ready to wait as long as necessary for love to overcome fear. Silas reached for the shovel with shaking hands, his decision crystallizing like frost on a winter window. Love had conquered fear just as Martha had said it would, but as his fingers closed around the worn wooden handle, the world around him suddenly shifted, reality bending like heated metal. The cabin walls became transparent, revealing not the familiar Montana wilderness, but something far older and more complex. Silas found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast underground chamber, its walls carved from living rock and illuminated by the same ethereal glow that emanated from the children's toys. Ancient symbols covered every surface, the same markings he'd seen on the crosses, but thousands of them layered and interconnected like the pages of an enormous book. "Welcome to the heart of it all," said a voice that wasn't Martha's. Silas spun around to find himself facing a figure he'd never seen before, a tall, ageless being whose features seemed to shift between masculine and feminine, young and old, human and something altogether other. The entity wore robes that appeared to be woven from starlight itself, and its eyes held the depth of centuries. "Who are you?" Silas demanded, gripping the shovel like a weapon. "I am the Keeper," the being replied, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in Silas's bones. "I am the one who has maintained this arrangement for longer than your kind has had words for time. And I'm afraid there are things about your situation that Martha was not permitted to tell you." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. "What things?" The Keeper gestured, and the chamber around them filled with images. Not visions this time, but actual memories playing out in three-dimensional clarity. Silas saw himself and Martha across multiple lifetimes, but now he noticed details that had been hidden before. In each incarnation, when they lost their children, they weren't simply grieving parents. They were conducting a ritual. Every death was a choice, the Keeper explained, its voice devoid of judgment but heavy with truth. Every child you lost was offered willingly to maintain the balance between your world and mine. 7 souls, freely given across 7 lifetimes to keep the barrier intact. Silas watched in horror as the scenes unfolded. He saw himself in frontier clothes, cradling a dying infant, while Martha chanted words in a language that predated civilization. He witnessed another version of himself, dressed as a Civil War soldier, burying a child who had never actually existed except as a spiritual offering. Life after life, the pattern repeated. They would create children through sheer force of will and love, then sacrifice them to maintain cosmic equilibrium. "We're not parents," Silas whispered, the terrible truth settling into his soul. "We're farmers. We've been harvesting souls. You are gardeners in the most literal sense," the Keeper confirmed. "Cultivators of life force, maintaining the boundary between the realm of the living and the realm of the waiting. Without your sacrifices, the barriers would collapse, and far worse things than sleeping children would spill into your world." A new artifact materialized in the air between them, an ancient stone tablet covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The markings seemed to writhe and shift, telling the story of a cosmic contract signed in blood and tears across the millennia. "This is the Covenant of Souls," the Keeper explained. "An agreement made when your kind first gained the ability to love deeply enough to transcend death. Someone had to guard the boundaries. Someone had to ensure that the natural order remained intact. You and Martha volunteered, lifetime after lifetime, because your love was pure enough to make the sacrifice meaningful." Silas's hands trembled as he reached toward the tablet, then jerked back as its surface burned with cold fire. "But the children in the mound, they're real. I've seen them. Oh, they're very real," the Keeper agreed. "But they're not your lost children, Silas. They're the previous guardians, 7 souls, who grew tired of the endless cycle and chose to sleep rather than continue their duties. You and Martha have been caring for them, keeping them in stasis, while you carried on their work." The chamber shifted again, and Silas found himself standing above the mound. But now he could see through the earth as if it were clear water. 7 forms lay in perfect preservation, not children at all, but adults whose features held the weight of ages. Their faces were serene, but around each one hung an aura of profound exhaustion. "They asked to rest," the Keeper continued, "to lay down the burden of guardianship and simply sleep until the universe no longer needed their service. You and Martha agreed to watch over them while maintaining the boundaries yourselves. And now," Silas asked, though he dreaded the answer, "now Martha is gone, and you grow old," the Keeper said simply. "The barriers weaken with each passing day. Soon you'll need to choose. Wake the sleeping guardians and return to your cycle of sacrifice, or join them in the earth and let someone else take up the burden." Silas looked back toward the cabin, where Martha still stood waiting by the window. But now he could see her true nature, not his beloved wife, but an echo, a projection of his own grief and desire given form by the supernatural energies that saturated this place. "She's not really Martha," he said, the words tasting like ashes. "She is everything Martha was," the Keeper replied. "Her memories, her love, her essence. But she exists now only as part of the covenant, sustained by the same forces that keep the guardians sleeping. If you choose to dig them up, to wake them, Martha will fade forever. The energy that maintains her presence will be redirected to restoring the ancient protectors. The cruel irony of it struck Silas like lightning. To gain the family he'd always dreamed of, to wake the children he thought were his own, he would have to lose Martha permanently. But to keep Martha's spirit alive, he would have to condemn 7 weary souls to continue sleeping while he faced the cosmic responsibility alone. "What happens if I refuse both choices?" Silas asked. "What if I just walk away?" The keeper's expression grew infinitely sad. "Then the barriers fail completely. Your world becomes overrun with entities that should never touch mortal reality. Millions die as the natural order collapses. And you live with the knowledge that you could have prevented it all." The stone tablet pulsed with renewed light, its symbols rearranging themselves into new configurations. Now Silas could read them clearly, and the message they conveyed chilled him to his core. The debt must be paid. The balance must be maintained. Love is the only currency that matters. How long do I have to decide? Silas asked, though part of him already knew he'd been making this choice his entire life. "Until dawn," the keeper replied. "When the sun rises, the current cycle ends, and the new one begins, with or without your conscious participation." The chamber began to fade around the edges, reality reasserting itself in layers. But before the vision completely dissolved, the keeper spoke one final time. "Know this, Silas Boone, whatever choice you make will be the right one. Love this pure cannot make wrong decisions, only difficult ones. The universe honors sacrifice, but it honors love even more." Then Silas was back in his cabin, standing beside the door with the shovel in his hands. Martha waited by the window, her translucent form flickering like candlelight. Outside, the 7 sleepers, not children, but ancient guardians, continued their patient dance around the mound. And in the distance, barely visible on the horizon, the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to touch the mountain peaks. The weight of cosmic responsibility pressed down on Silas, like the entire mountain range had settled on his shoulders. He stood motionless in his cabin, shovel in hand, while the minutes ticked toward dawn and the most impossible decision of any lifetime. Every breath felt borrowed. Every heartbeat counted against a deadline that would reshape reality itself. Martha's spirit flickered by the window, her form growing more translucent as the night wore on. She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not just love, but understanding. She knew what the keeper had revealed. She had always known. "You heard everything," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for you to hear it too," Martha replied, her voice carrying the sound of wind through autumn leaves. "The truth was always there, my love. In every lifetime, in every choice we made together. We just weren't ready to see it clearly." Silas set the shovel against the doorframe and moved to the window, studying the 7 figures who danced around the mound with increasing urgency. Now that he knew their true nature, he could see the weight they carried. Centuries of guardianship etched into their movements, exhaustion masked by duty. The desperate hope of souls who had sacrificed everything for a cause greater than themselves. "How long were they guardians before they chose to sleep?" he asked. 3,000 years, Martha answered. "They were the first to volunteer when the covenant was established. They've been sleeping for only 2 centuries, a brief rest. Compared to their service, a new artifact materialized. On the table beside his chair, an ornate hourglass filled with sand that glowed like pulverized stars. The sand was falling steadily, and Silas instinctively knew it measured the time remaining until dawn. Perhaps an hour left, maybe less. "The keeper's hourglass," Martha explained, noticing his gaze. "It appears whenever a guardian must make the ultimate choice. The sand represents not just time, but the weight of every soul that will be affected by the decision." Silas watched the luminous grains fall, each one representing thousands of lives hanging in the balance. The enormity of it was staggering. How could one old man's choice determine the fate of so many? "Tell me about the others," he said, turning back to the window. "Tell me about the guardians who are sleeping." Martha's expression grew fond, as if she were speaking of dear friends. Ileana was the first, a Roman woman who lost 7 children to plague and bargained with forces beyond death to protect other families from the same fate. She served alone for 800 years before finding her partner Marcus. Outside, Silas could now see the truth in the dancing figures. The woman who had appeared to be a child in a blue dress was actually Ileana, her ancient soul compressed into the form of innocent youth. Her dance spoke of weariness beyond measure, but also of enduring strength. The twins you saw, they're actually Keiko and Hiroshi, brother and sister from feudal Japan. They were shrine keepers who discovered that the barrier between worlds ran through their temple grounds. They maintained it for 6 centuries before joining the others here. The 2 figures who moved in perfect synchronization revealed their true nature now, not children playing, but siblings whose bond had been forged in shared duty and mutual sacrifice. Their dance wove patterns of protection and blessing, movements learned through decades of ritual practice. Samuel was never a child at all. He's actually Thaddeus, a Celtic druid who understood the old ways before Christianity swept across his lands. He's been here the longest after Ileana and Marcus, over 700 years of service. The serious figure, Silas had thought, was a 12-year-old boy, carried himself with the dignity of ages. His movements speaking of deep connection to the earth and growing things. His dance honored the natural cycles that the guardians protected, and the youngest appearing one. Martha smiled sadly. That's Zara, a nomad from the steppes who never had children of her own, but gave her life to protecting all children everywhere. She served for 4 centuries before the exhaustion became too much to bear. Each revelation recontextualized what Silas had witnessed over the past days. These weren't lost children seeking parents. They were ancient souls who had carried burdens beyond imagination, now desperate for someone to relieve them of their watch. What about the one who seems to shift forms? Kai, Martha said softly, a Pacific islander whose people understood that some souls transcend the boundaries of single identities. Kai has been male and female, young and old, human and something beyond human, across 5 centuries of guardianship. They're the most fluid of the sleepers, adapting to whatever form the cosmic balance requires. The figure in question seemed to pulse between different appearances, even as Silas watched. Sometimes a small child, sometimes an ancient elder, sometimes something that defied easy categorization. Their dance incorporated movements from cultures across the globe, a living library of human spiritual practice. And the last one? Martha's expression grew particularly tender. That's Ezra, a scholar from Baghdad who discovered the mathematical principles underlying the cosmic barriers. He spent 3 centuries developing rituals and protocols that made the Guardians' work more efficient. He looks like you because, in a way, he is you. The same type of soul drawn to this responsibility across different lifetimes. The resemblance was unmistakable now that Silas knew what to look for. Ezra carried himself with the same careful deliberation that had always characterized Silas's approach to mountain life. His dance spoke of patience, planning, and the kind of methodical devotion that could sustain difficult work across centuries. As Silas watched, understanding dawned. These 7 guardians weren't just random souls who had volunteered for cosmic duty. They were archetypes, different aspects of the guardian nature that he and Martha had embodied across their multiple lifetimes. Ileana was the protective mother, Marcus the steadfast father, Keiko and Hiroshi the bonded siblings, Thaddeus the wise elder, Zara the selfless caregiver, Kai the adaptable shapeshifter, and Ezra the careful scholar. We're all the same soul, Silas realized. Different expressions of the same fundamental nature. Now you begin to understand, Martha confirmed. The covenant doesn't bind random volunteers. It calls to specific types of souls, those capable of love so profound it can transcend death itself. We're all part of the same spiritual family, taking turns carrying the burden. The hourglass on the table chimed softly, its sand now less than a quarter full. Dawn was approaching with inexorable certainty, and with it, the moment when Silas would have to choose not just his own fate, but the fate of countless souls across multiple realities. "If I wake them," Silas said slowly, "they'll have to resume their duties immediately?" "Not immediately," Martha replied. "They'll need time to remember themselves, to adjust to the changes that have occurred during their sleep. But yes, eventually they'll return to guardianship. The cosmic balance demands it, and if I choose to continue alone—" Martha's form flickered more violently, her edges becoming increasingly indistinct. "Then I can remain with you for a little while longer, but the burden will grow heavier with each passing year. Eventually you'll need help, and by then it may be too late to wake them safely." The dancing figures outside had stopped their movements and now stood in a circle around the mound, all 7 facing the cabin. Their expressions were no longer those of children seeking parents, but of ancient souls offering a choice between shared burden and solitary responsibility. Jasper rose from his position by the fire and padded to Silas's side. The dog's translucent form pressed against his leg, offering what comfort a spirit companion could provide. Even in death, Jasper remained loyal, ready to face whatever choice his master made. The hourglass chimed again, its tone more urgent now. The sand continued to fall, carrying with it the weight of worlds. And somewhere in the distance, barely perceptible but growing stronger, came the sound of roosters crowing, the mountain farms waking to greet the dawn that would change everything. Silas picked up the shovel once more, its worn handle familiar in his grip. The blade had dug gardens and graves, had broken ground for foundations, and turned earth for planting. Now it would serve one final purpose, either to wake 7 ancient guardians or to begin digging his own grave beside the mound. The choice was his, and dawn was coming whether he was ready or not. The first rooster crow echoed across the valley like a gunshot, shattering the supernatural silence that had held the mountain in its grip. Silas felt the sound in his bones, a clarion call announcing that his time for contemplation had ended. The hourglass on the table released its final grains of starlight sand, its last chime reverberating through the cabin like a funeral bell. "It's time," Martha whispered, her form now so translucent that the lamplight passed through her like morning mist. "Whatever you choose, my love, choose it with your whole heart." Silas stepped onto the porch, shovel gripped firmly in both hands. The 7 guardians stood motionless around the mound, their ancient eyes fixed on him with expressions of infinite patience and understanding. They had waited 2 centuries for this moment. They could wait a few minutes more. The eastern sky was lightening, painting the peaks with the faintest blush of rose. Dawn was perhaps 10 minutes away, maybe 15. Enough time to dig, if he chose to dig. Enough time to wake them, if waking them was the right choice. But as Silas descended the steps, a new artifact caught his attention, something that hadn't been there moments before. Embedded in the earth at the exact center of the mound was a crystalline formation about the size of his fist. It pulsed within a light, its faceted surface reflecting the pre-dawn sky in impossible colors. "The heart of the covenant," came the keeper's voice, though the entity itself remained invisible. "The physical anchor that binds all guardians to their sacred duty. It has been growing beneath your land for 2 centuries, fed by the sleeping guardians' combined will." Silas approached the crystal with reverent caution. Even from several feet away, he could feel its power, a thrumming energy that seemed to resonate with his own heartbeat. The surface wasn't just reflecting light. It was generating it, drawing energy from sources beyond the physical world. "If I dig this up," Silas said aloud, knowing the keeper could hear him, "what happens to the crystal?" "It becomes yours to wield," the invisible entity replied. "The focal point for all guardian power, the tool that makes maintaining the cosmic barriers possible. But it can only be wielded by one who has made the ultimate sacrifice. The choice to put the welfare of all souls above personal desire." The light in the east grew stronger, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Silas could feel time itself holding its breath, waiting for his decision. The 7 guardians remained perfectly still, but their forms seemed to grow more solid with each passing moment, as if his mere presence was beginning to wake them regardless of his choice. Martha appeared beside him, her spirit form barely visible in the growing daylight. "Look at them, Silas," she said softly. "Really look at them. See what they're offering you." Silas focused on each guardian in turn, and for the first time he could perceive their true emotions. Eliana's face showed not impatience, but hope. The hope of a mother who had sacrificed everything for her children and finally saw the possibility of rest. Marcus stood with the quiet dignity of a father who had never stopped protecting his family, even in sleep. The siblings, Keiko and Hiroshi, held hands, their bond unbroken by centuries of shared burden, but it was Ezra who spoke to Silas most directly. The scholar's eyes held understanding, recognition, and something that might have been relief. Here was a soul who had carried responsibility alone for too long, who knew the weight of solitary guardianship and the toll it exacted on the spirit. "You don't have to bear this alone," Ezra's voice whispered directly into Silas's mind. "We chose to sleep not because we were weak, but because we knew others would come. We knew you would come." The crystal pulsed brighter, responding to the proximity of a guardian's touch. Silas knelt beside the mound, his weathered hands hovering inches above the glowing artifact. He could feel the power contained within it, enough energy to reshape reality, to maintain barriers between worlds, to protect countless souls from forces they couldn't even imagine. But with that power came responsibility that would span lifetimes. Accept the crystal, wake the guardians, and he would be committing not just himself, but his eternal soul to cosmic service. There would be no retirement, no peaceful death, no simple ending to his story. "Martha," he said without turning around, knowing she was listening, "if I do this, if I wake them and take up the crystal, will I see you again? Ever?" Her silence stretched long enough that he almost looked back. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of infinite love and infinite sadness. "Not as I am now," she admitted. "But somewhere in some lifetime yet to come, we'll find each other again. We always do, my love. That's the one constant in all of this. Souls like ours are drawn together across eternity." The sky continued to lighten, and the crystal's glow intensified in response. Soon, very soon, the sun would break the horizon, and the moment of choice would pass forever. Silas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every soul depending on his decision, feeling the love that had sustained him across multiple lifetimes, feeling the profound responsibility that came with being chosen for something greater than ordinary existence. When he opened his eyes, his decision was made. With a determination born of decades of mountain living and the accumulated wisdom of multiple lifetimes, Silas drove the shovel into the earth beside the crystalline heart. The soil parted like water, offering no resistance to his blade. The mound seemed eager to reveal its secrets, as if it had been waiting for this moment since the first guardian had chosen to sleep. The first scoop of earth revealed more than dirt. It uncovered memories. As Silas dug, visions flowed through the disturbed soil like living things. He saw Eliana's final moments of consciousness, laying herself down in this sacred space with tears of relief streaming down her face. He witnessed Marcus joining her, their hands finding each other even in the depths of supernatural sleep. Each guardian had come to this place, carrying the weight of centuries, and each had surrendered their burden with gratitude rather than regret. The crystal grew brighter with each shovelful of earth removed, its faceted surface beginning to sing, a harmony of 7 distinct voices blending into something achingly beautiful. The sound wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language, but it spoke directly to Silas's soul, telling him stories of cosmic balance and the price of protection. "They're waking," Martha's voice came from somewhere very far away, her spirit form now barely visible even to Silas's enhanced perception. "Can you feel them stirring?" Indeed, the 7 figures around the mound were beginning to move with more animation, their ancient eyes blinking as if emerging from the deepest of dreams. Their forms grew more solid with each moment, taking on weight and substance as the crystal's power flowed back into them. As Silas continued to dig, his shovel struck something that wasn't earth, a carved stone surface, smooth and warm to the touch. He cleared away more soil, revealing an altar of sorts, a circular platform inscribed with the same symbols that covered the crosses and the covenant tablet. At its center, the crystal sat in a perfectly fitted depression, as if the entire structure had been grown around it. The awakening altar, he breathed, recognizing it from Martha's journal entries. This was where the original covenant had been sealed, where the first guardians had pledged their eternal service to the cosmic balance. A new artifact materialized. On the altar's surface, an ancient chalice carved from the same crystalline material as the heart itself. The cup filled with liquid that looked like captured starlight, swirling with galaxies in miniature. Silas instinctively knew what it was, the draught of eternal service, the final seal that would bind him to his guardianship and complete the awakening ritual. The sun's first ray broke over the eastern peaks at that moment, painting the mountain in gold and crimson. The light struck the crystal heart directly, causing it to flare with such brilliance that Silas had to shield his eyes. When his vision cleared, the 7 guardians were no longer translucent spirits, but fully corporeal beings, blinking in the dawn light like people waking from the most restful sleep of their lives. Ileana was the first to speak, her voice carrying the authority of millennia. "Welcome, new guardian," she said, her ancient eyes meeting Silas's with profound gratitude. "We have waited so long for someone worthy to take up the burden." "The barriers have held," Marcus added, stretching arms that hadn't moved in 2 centuries. "Your vigilance maintained them while we rested. The cosmic balance is intact." One by one, the other guardians spoke their thanks and their blessings. Ezra approached the altar with movements that spoke of vast relief, his scholarly mind already assessing the changes that had occurred during their sleep. "The world has changed much," he observed, "but the fundamental need for protection remains constant." Kai stepped forward, their form stabilizing into that of a middle-aged person whose gender seemed fluid and whose face held the wisdom of ages. "The choice is still yours," they said gently. "We are awake, but you need not join us if your heart is not fully committed. The crystal can sustain us alone for a time while you decide." But Silas had already made his decision. He reached for the chalice, its crystalline surface warm beneath his fingers. The liquid inside swirled with possibilities, lifetimes of service, endless responsibility, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that his choices would protect countless souls from forces beyond their comprehension. "Martha," he said quietly, knowing she could still hear him even as her form faded with the rising sun. "I love you. I'll find you again." Her voice came like a whisper on the wind. "I know you will, my brave guardian. I know you will." Silas raised the chalice to his lips and drank deeply. The liquid tasted like starlight and time itself, burning through his veins with power that transformed every cell in his body. He felt his mortality falling away like shed skin, replaced by something vast and enduring and eternally committed to the protection of all souls. As the transformation completed, 8 guardians stood around the awakening altar, their combined will flowing into the crystal heart. The barriers between worlds strengthened, the cosmic balance stabilized, and across countless realities, sleeping souls rested easier knowing that love had once again proven stronger than death. The mountain welcomed its newest eternal protector with a sunrise that seemed to last forever. 6 months had passed since the awakening, though time moved differently for the guardians now. Silas stood on his porch, the same porch he'd stood on as a mortal man, but everything had changed. The cabin remained, but it had been joined by 7 other structures, each reflecting the cultural heritage of its guardian inhabitant. Eliana's Roman villa sat nestled among the pines, while Keiko and Hiroshi's traditional Japanese house overlooked a carefully tended garden. The community they'd built existed partially outside normal space, visible only to those with the sight to see beyond ordinary reality. The mound was gone, replaced by the awakening altar, which now served as the center of their shared power. The crystal heart pulsed gently in its stone cradle, no longer buried, but proudly displayed as the focal point of their guardianship. Around it, new artifacts had appeared, tools of their trade that manifested as needed. Today it was the compass of lost souls that drew Silas's attention. The intricate device appeared whenever someone in the world below was in desperate need of the kind of help only guardians could provide. Its needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that pointed toward the distant town at the base of the mountain. "Another one?" Ezra asked, emerging from his library, a structure that somehow contained every book ever written about the supernatural, plus many that had yet to be written. "A child," Silas confirmed, reading the compass's ethereal display. "Lost between worlds, pulled towards something that shouldn't exist in the mortal realm." It was the kind of work that had given his existence new meaning. No longer was he simply maintaining barriers. Now he actively protected those who stumbled too close to forces beyond their understanding. Sometimes it meant guiding lost spirits back to their proper rest. Other times it involved stopping human interference with powers that could unravel reality itself. "I'll come with you," offered Zara, approaching with the fluid grace that all guardians possessed. Her form today appeared as a young woman in hiking clothes, though Silas knew she could manifest as anything the situation required. Children respond better to a gentler presence. They descended the mountain together, moving at the speed of thought rather than footsteps. To mortal eyes, they would appear as two ordinary people out for a walk, if they appeared at all. Most humans instinctively looked away from guardians, their minds refusing to process what their eyes couldn't quite understand. The town had grown since Silas's mortal days, but it still retained the character of a place where people minded their own business and asked few questions. They found their target quickly, a 7-year-old girl standing at the edge of the town cemetery, staring at a grave that glowed with sickly green light, visible only to supernatural sight. "Emily?" the child was saying, her voice carrying the confusion of someone too young to understand what she was seeing. "Emily, are you in there?" Silas's enhanced perception immediately identified the problem. The grave contained the spirit of a child who had died 50 years ago, but something was preventing her from moving on to whatever came next. The dead girl was trying to communicate with the living one, creating a dangerous bridge between worlds that could pull the mortal child into the realm of the dead. "Hello there," Zara said gently, approaching the living child with the kind of warm authority that made people trust her instinctively. "I'm Zara, and this is Silas. We're here to help." The little girl looked up with eyes too old for her face. "The lady in the ground says she's lonely. She says she wants me to come play with her." "I'm sure she does," Silas said, kneeling to the child's level. "But she doesn't understand that you belong up here with your family. Sometimes people who've been sleeping in the ground forget how the world works." He placed his hand on the gravestone, feeling the desperate longing of the trapped spirit. Emily, the name was no coincidence, had died in a house fire decades ago, but her grief-stricken parents had bound her to the earth with their refusal to let go. She'd been trapped ever since, growing increasingly desperate for companionship. "Emily," Silas said, speaking directly to the spirit, "it's time to stop sleeping now. It's time to go where children who've died are supposed to go." The green light flared brighter, and for a moment the dead child became visible even to mortal eyes. A girl in a singed nightgown, her face streaked with tears of longing. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I've been trying for so long, but something holds me here." Silas looked deeper, his guardian sight revealing the truth. Invisible chains of grief and guilt bound the spirit to her grave, forged by parents who had never learned to let go of their loss. But those parents had died years ago. Their own spirits moved on, leaving their daughter trapped by bonds they no longer maintained. "You're free now," Silas said, reaching out with power, drawn from the crystal heart miles away. "Your mama and papa are waiting for you in the place where families go after death. But you have to choose to join them." The chains dissolved at his touch, crumbling like rust in the wind. Emily's spirit looked around in wonder, as if seeing clearly for the first time in decades. "I can go?" she asked. "You can go," Zara confirmed. "And you should go quickly, before the loneliness makes you try to stay again." Light began to gather around the dead child, warm golden light that spoke of reunion and peace. She turned to the living girl one last time. "Thank you for being my friend," she said. "But you belong with the living people, and I belong with the dead ones." Then she was gone, ascending toward whatever realm waited for souls who had completed their earthly journey. The cemetery returned to normal, just another collection of stones marking ordinary graves. "Will she be okay?" the living child asked, looking around as if suddenly unsure how she'd gotten there. "She'll be fine," Silas assured her. "And so will you. But maybe it's time to go home to your family now." They watched the girl walk away, her step lighter than it had been, the supernatural weight lifted from her young shoulders. Another crisis averted, another soul guided to where it belonged. It was work that would never end, but it was also work that gave meaning to immortal existence. As they prepared to return to the mountain, Zara smiled at her newest colleague. "Ready for the next one?" Silas looked back toward their hidden community, where ancient souls had found new purpose in shared responsibility. "Always," he said. "After all, he had eternity to get it right."